Shalom and welcome back to another episode in our series called Picture This from Israel. Today we're going to transport ourselves back to about 70 to 73 AD and picture ourselves as one of maybe 967 Jews who found refuge here at Masada after the destruction of the temple. There are so many places that we could take you to help us picture what it would have been like to be one of these Jews. Now, Josephus is the one who gives us all of these details. And 967 according to him, although there may have been a few more, because some skeletal remains have been found and actually reburied here at Masada, but let's just say close to 1,000 Jews after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, they made their way up to this palace fortress. And we're here in the synagogue. I want you to try to picture, perhaps, and imagine what would have been going through the minds and the hearts of those who knew that the Romans now were pressing on. They built a Roman ramp that we'll see next in order to bring a big battering ram to the top. So the decision was made, perhaps even in this synagogue by some of the leaders, that the Jews would rather fall on their own swords than to fall by means of the swords of the Romans. This was a dignified way for them to take their own lives, as harsh as that may sound, but rather than to be killed by Romans. They also found here in the synagogue a scroll similar to an ancient scroll found nearby to the north of here at a place called Qumran. But they found the scroll of Ezekiel 37. If you recall, that's the text, the chapter in Ezekiel that speaks about the dry bones. But just imagine yourself sitting in here. You know the end is near. You perhaps have a family, a wife, loved ones, and you make the decision now, as the Romans are getting close to taking over this palace fortress, originally built by Herod the Great in the late 30s BC, after he becomes king in 37, or ruler, I should say, as well. But it's just really a heartbreaking emotion, perhaps, knowing that your life is near to the end and that decision was made. And that's exactly what happened. And we know this story because of a few women and children who actually survived this. And they are the ones who, in part, tell the story. Let's take a look at the Roman ramp on the west side and talk about maybe what it would have been like as a Roman, picturing their life here for maybe almost 3 years, surrounding this palace fortress and trying to get to the top. On our way over to the Roman ramp, this is called a columbarium, and you can see all these niches. These are for pigeons. If you remember, pigeons were an integral part of the sacrifice system. If you didn't have an animal at hand, well, a pigeon sufficed as a means of sacrifice. Imagine yourself here in this columbarium, trying to track down a pigeon and maybe offering it, but as a sacrifice. But here is just a perfect view of the Roman ramp too, and you can see it down below. What the Romans did is they first of all built a camp. Silva was the name of the general, and there is his camp. Josephus tells us that Romans could build a camp just within a few days. So Silvus, or Silva, sometimes referred to, is the general who oversees eventually the building of this Roman ramp. Now, what the Romans did, and now we can try to picture what their life would have been like. They built a wall around the Masada to prevent Jews from going down the east side, down the snake path, and getting out and finding help or resources. Although the Jews up here had plenty of water, they had 12 cisterns, and archaeologically a lot of grain, dried fruit was found, so they had no need for that. Water and food were plentiful, but imagine yourself being a Roman trying to survive in the hot heat of the desert and then building this Roman ramp. Let's get another view of this ramp from a different perspective. And now here's our new perspective of this ramp looking down. The shade is a bit challenging to get a good sense of this, but perhaps we can just go down a little ways to get a good picture of how the ramp was made. A battering ram then was positioned on top of this this siege ramp and brought up to this what is called a casemate wall, and they had great intentions to topple this wall. Casemate wall is a double wall that served as a strong fortification against the enemy. In fact, let's try to walk down to at least see part of that Roman ramp, and again the Roman camp there in the distance. This is the west side. So this Roman ramp was built for the purpose of positioning the battering ram to go up to the casemate wall at the top of this palace fortress. There's a whole group of Orthodox Jews below me, so we're not going to go down in this video. But I'm zooming into this ramp, an earthen ramp with stone, and yet even acacia trees that are still sticking up from 2,000 years ago. It's really a remarkable preservation of this ramp built by the Romans. Probably indeed had slaves to do this. But there it is, this Roman ramp built after the unsuccessful attempts to get to the top where the Jews were hiding out, if you will, in this former palace fortress built by Herod the Great. So let's also try to picture how these Jews survived here on Masada. It only rains a couple times a year here in this part of the Judean Desert. So what was built were 12 of these huge cisterns. I'm carefully walking down these big steps. Of course, these are modern steps today, but these cisterns are incredible. Look how large this is. Let's just stop here to get a perspective from this angle. You would have kept this entirely closed. You can see the plaster as well that prevented water simply to seep into the softer limestone. But look how big the cistern actually is. So these Jews, as Josephus tells us, frolicked in the water. The Romans, who wilted away in the summer heat, it's just over 100 degrees most of the time. They had to bring water from the nearby spring at Engedi, about a 20-minute bus ride to the north. So imagine the task of doing that consistently, where the Jews, when it would rain, they diverted the water into cisterns like this. It was a remarkable engineering feat of how they accomplished that. So imagine the plentiful amount of water contained in a cistern. This is the largest of the 12. Try to picture yourself now as the leader of these Jews, nearly 1,000 of them. His name was Eliezer ben Yair. He had the role of leading the Jews to make that difficult decision, but he was no doubt familiar with this three-step northern palace that Herod the Great, well before him, in the 30s BC, this palace that was built by Herod the Great with a great view of the Dead Sea and even in the distance in Gedi. Before we go down to end this video at the Northern Palace, let's get another angle of this Roman camp where the general Silvus was positioned. Imagine yourself, picture yourself as a Roman soldier. You're serving the general, you're hot, you're thirsty, and yet you've been deemed the task of this Roman ramp. And this is yet another perspective of it. Looking north to south. This Roman ramp still exists today. What a difficult job that must have been for those involved in building this siege ramp. Picture yourself as Herod the Great. Of course, you didn't have these steps that we're using to get down to this lower level of the three-tier palace here on the north side, but this is where we're heading. There are some who say Herod the Great was never here. I would probably argue that he must have been here, not just to oversee the building project, but the glory, the prestige of this place, the amazing engineering, and of course this three-tier palace where he must have, especially in the winter, from his winter palace in Jericho, perhaps he came here as well, served by others, and certainly with the great view of this Judean Desert. We'll make our way down to the lower level now. One last turn or two until we reach this lower level of this palace. This has been remarkably restored, although some of the frescoes that we see have been redone. Back 40 years ago, these were the original frescoes. Now, as I understand, they have been redone to look like the original ones. Let's consider Herod the Great once again before we picture a few other things before we quit this video. Herod the Great would have had a great view of En-Gedi, which we see now coming into view north of us. The persimmon made into a perfume was sort of his means of cash income. Visiting that site next, there it is. Was and still is a spring, one of just a couple of springs here along the Dead Sea. So we made it to this northern palace. You know, there's so much to see here at Masada, this palace fortress originally built by Herod the Great. But we've pictured ourselves as Herod himself, who built this palace. You can still see what appears to be the original frescoes. I believe these are also reconstructions, but 40 years ago, they were the real thing. This northern palace, Herod the Great, picture him here. We can also picture the Jews who held out for almost 3 years here on top of Masada until they took their own lives. But Masada, even though it's not mentioned in the Bible, could it also have been a place where David, well before this was even built up by Herod the Great, of course, the passages in 1 Samuel between chapters 18 and 24 or 5, David is being pursued by King Saul. And a few believe that this standalone mountain could have been also a place where David retreated to. So we can picture all of these people being here. We can imagine what view they had and what view we still have today of the Dead Sea. Across the way on the other side, the country of Jordan. Those are the hills of Moab. Just a remarkable view from here. And we can picture it all happening. Masada is not mentioned in the Bible, but just keep in mind that the word Masada in Hebrew means fortress. It appears all over the place, especially as we read this morning from Psalm 18, as we took off from just south of us. I read for our group Psalm 18. God is our rock, he is our Masada. So thanks for picturing all of these people and these events here at this palace fortress. Hope you're having a great day, and once again, let's enjoy the view around this northern palace, and now looking north to Engedi, where we are heading next. Have a great day. Until next time, shalom.